Good afternoon. My name is Alana Brown, and I am presenting the Safe Sisters Amara Legal Center, and I am talking about domestic violence and unhealthy dating relationships. I was presented by me, Alana C. Brown, the founder and executive director of the Safe Sister Circle. So, who are the Safe Sister Circle, and who are we? Well, the Safe Sister Circle is a 501c3 nonprofit that provides free, culture-specific, holistic, and trauma-based services to Black women survivors of domestic violence and or sexual assault, primarily living in Washington, D.C.'s Ward 7 or 8. Our East of the River Women's Legal Services projects represent women and their families in civil protection order hearings, family law cases, and victim trial advocacy. So what is domestic violence? Well, there's dating violence and intimate partner violence. These are two terms commonly used when we say domestic violence. Domestic violence, also called intimate partner violence or IPV, or relationship abuse, is a pattern of behaviors used by one partner to maintain power and control over another partner in an intimate relationship. I put the focus on power because that is a big part of domestic violence. One person's ability to use power to control another person in various ways to abuse them. Domestic violence is when a person uses their power or control to abuse someone they have a former, current, or prior sexual, intimate, dating, or emotional relationship with. The power and control will. So survivors of domestic violence experience physical and sexual violence as well as psychological harm and trauma. So it's not just how you traditionally think of things as, physical abuse or hitting someone or kicking someone. It's also emotional abuse. So we see that power and control will. There is economic abuse. A lot of women rely on their significant others to live off of, the ones who are working. So they have financial control over them. So they can't leave because they're the ones who provide them food and income and provide their children food and income to the families. The using of children against them, saying, I'll hurt your children, or, this is the father of my children, and I want my children to have their father in their lives. Using intimidation, using isolation, taking them away from the rest of their families, minimizing and denying and blaming. Different forms of abuse can be found within domestic violence. So what are different forms of abuse? The first one is the basic one, physical abuse. Any intentional use of physical force with the intent to cause fear or injury, like hitting, shoving, biting, strangling, kicking, or using a weapon. Verbal or emotional abuse. Non-physical behaviors such as threats, insults, constant monitoring, humiliation, intimidation, isolation, or stalking. Sexual abuse. Any action that impacts a person's ability to control their sexual activity or the circumstances in which sexual activity occurs, including rape, coercion, or restricting access to birth control. And the last one could also be known as reproductive justice or reproductive abuse, which basically means it's control of women or a person to have a child or not have a child, whether to use birth control or not use birth control, whether for the partner to use a condom or not use a condom, or whether the person makes the decision to have a child or a decision not to have a child. There's different intersections within the different categories of domestic violence. There's also digital abuse. This is the use of technology or social media networking to intimidate, harass, or threaten a current or ex-dating partner, such as demanding passwords, checking cell phones, cyberbullying. And cyberbullying would be an example of, sending your partner sexy photos or naked photos or something like that. And after you break up, they put them online on social media, on IG or something. And they post slut or hoe, or they just put them online against your will. And that's a type of cyberbullying, and it is a domestic violence incident, a type of digital abuse against their partner. Non-consensual sexting, sending them a picture of their penis to a person that you didn't ask for. Excessive or threatening text or stalking on social media, always following them on all their accounts, sending them messages on all their accounts, not letting them go on all their accounts. These are just different forms of digital domestic violence abuse. Stalking, being repeatedly watched, followed, monitored, or harassed. Stalking can occur online or in person and may or may not include giving unwanted gifts. So stalking could be something like give someone something nice, like giving them a teddy bear or giving them nice flowers every day. But if it's unwanted and you don't want these things, it could be stalking and can be seen as a type of abuse. And then there's financial abuse, exerting power and control over a partner through their finances, including taking or withholding money from a partner or prohibiting a partner from earning or spending their money. So what we most recently have seen this in is stimulus checks. And people have been first taking stimulus checks from their partners, the women partners, and male partners have been using it for themselves instead of giving it to the woman to use for their families, to feed them and to support their families. or men getting stimulus checks and not sharing it with their families. So this, again, using power control of the partner through the finances to keep them under control. So domestic violence impacts certain races and ethnicity groups more than others. So statistically, this is true. Black women have higher rates of domestic violence and sexual abuse than any other ethnic or racial group. 21% of Black women have been domestic violence or intimate partner violence victims. There's a correlation between high rates of domestic and sexual violence of women who work and live in low-income communities with high rates of violence. As we know, because of cultural and systematic racism, that most people who live in low-income, high rates of violence communities happen to be Black people, unfortunately, including Black women. So how does this relate to DC? Well, we look at Ward 7 or 8, and there's the highest percentage of Black people in DC, 95 to 95% Black. There's the highest poverty rate. About 27% of residents live below the poverty line. The first and second highest rates of violence in DC are Ward 7 and 8. And the highest rates of reported domestic violence calls DC to the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence come from Ward 7 and 8. So looking at unhealthy relationships. So how do I know if me or one of my friends is in an unhealthy relationship? And where can I seek help? So there are lots of red flags of unhealthy relationship that you can look for yourself or your friends. Extreme jealousy, insecurity, checking email or cell phones of your partners constantly and without permission, constantly checking social media accounts without permission, making false accusations, physically inflicting pain or harm in any way, repeatedly pressuring someone to have sex, controlling someone's action, temper, mood swings, either happy or sad, back and forth, and isolation of yourself from your friends and family. So where can you get help? First and foremost, the National Domestic Violence Hotline. You can call them for crisis intervention or to call them if you get immediate help. Their number is 1-800-709-7233. Or you can contact us if you're in the DC area, the Safe Sister Circle. Our information line is info@safesistercircle.org. Our email address is www.safesistercircle.org. And for Black women, there's two major sources out there that deal with Black women and domestic sexual violence. The first one is UGMA, and they're ugemadc.org. And it's Women of Color Network, WOCN.org. And these organizations are specifically geared to women of color, and UGMA for Black women who are survivors of sexual assault and abuse and domestic violence. How to contact me, Alana. So my direct contact is alana.brown@safesistercircle.org or 202-596-5209. If you have any questions or you want any follow-ups to this presentation, or know a friend or yourself to be in trouble or need legal representation or referral services, please feel free to reach out to me directly. But if you just have general information or general questions, you can always email our general info line at info@safesistercircle.org. So I just wanted to thank you for your time today, and I hope you were able to get some information today about domestic violence and unhealthy relationships. And now I'm going to turn the conversation to Christine Greene from Amara Legal Services about human sexual trafficking. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Christine Greene, and I'm an attorney at the Amara Legal Center in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about human trafficking. You just heard from Ms. Alana Brown about domestic violence. And while there are some similarities between domestic violence and human trafficking, there are also some big differences. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. So we'll just dive right in. Who are we? The Amara Legal Center. We are based in Washington, D.C., and we provide free, high-quality, trauma-informed, holistic legal services in the D.C. metropolitan area, that would be D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, to anyone who's involved in commercial sex. And whether that involvement is by choice or not, by coercion, force, circumstance, or necessity. We employ a trauma-informed legal approach here at Amara. What does that mean? A trauma-informed legal practice recognizes the role that trauma plays in the lawyer-client relationship, and it reduces re-traumatization. So we believe that there has to be an atmosphere of honesty and trust in order for lawyers to advocate effectively for their clients. Accordingly, all of our clients are sex trafficking survivors and sex workers who are marginalized in society. And Amara is the only legal services provider in the District of Columbia whose only mission is to serve this population. Since its founding in 2013, Amara has provided free legal services to well over 500 clients in DC. Amara, here we have a culturally specific, trauma-informed, again, multidisciplinary approach to legal advocacy. Toward that goal, we provide full representation, limited scope representation, and legal advice in the following matters: criminal defense, civil protection orders, that's domestic violence. Someone may need an order of protection from their abusers or traffickers. Divorce, child custody, child support, victim witness advocacy, criminal record sealing, expungement, and vacatur of criminal records. And that's really significant. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. So sex trafficking and labor trafficking, what does that mean? Sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purposes of the Commercial Sex Act, in which the commercial act is induced by force or fraud or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act, the sex act, has not yet reached the age of 18. So what does that mean? It means that if someone is engaging in sex for value and they are under 18, it's automatically sex trafficking, whether that minor thinks that they are consenting to this or not. Minors cannot consent. So if they're under 18, it's automatically sex trafficking. And this is significant because many states have what's called safe harbor laws for minors. And what does that mean? It means that minors have immunity, cannot be prosecuted for certain types of offenses that they were induced to engage in or forced to commit while involved in sex trafficking. For instance, DC, it completely prohibits the criminalization of minors for prostitution offenses. Maryland law doesn't prohibit the criminalization of minors for these offenses. However, survivors are able to raise what's called an affirmative defense of duress under prostitution-related offenses. In other words, they can say that I engaged in this criminal act, whatever it is, because I was being forced to. I was being forced to sell sex for money. Virginia law, at this current time, Virginia law does not prohibit the criminalization of minors for prostitution offenses, nor does Virginia at this present time offer any defenses for survivors to raise. Hopefully that's changing soon. Our Virginia attorney is working very closely with the legislature to change that, and it looks like it's going to be happening soon. So that is good news that is on the way. Labor trafficking. What is labor trafficking? Labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, coercion, or for the purposes of subjecting them to involuntary servitude, debt bondage. So this is forcing someone to do something for value, but not sex. That's the difference between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So this is one of the many interesting graphics that we use in our presentation. So I'm going to ask the question. I know you can't answer them because this is being recorded, but I'll just ask you to take a look at these graphics and see what stands out to you. Take a couple of seconds to check this out. So when you do a Google search for the terms human trafficking, these are some of the images that you'll see. These are some of the things that pop up. We have this slide because it illustrates something significant. So what do you notice? What jumps out about how the victims of trafficking are portrayed? They're all mostly white women. There's one graphic there, a white woman with a black man's hand over her mouth. And then what do you notice about how traffickers are portrayed? Primarily men of color. That's how the traffickers are stereotypically portrayed in the media. And this speaks like to the model victim, that there's one perfect image of what a victim of trafficking looks like. When in reality, we know that every trafficking experience is different. Often, again, the media portrays trafficking in terms of physical restraint or bondage. You'll see the hands over the mouth, or the next slide, you'll see ropes or chains. This can be a problem portraying it this way because If we as a society view trafficking as a primarily physical form of abuse, then we as a community and as service providers may not identify victims who are coerced through non-physical means, like emotional manipulation or financial abuse or many other methods of control. Here are some more pictures that sort of speak to the same stereotypical portrayals, and these are just as problematic for the same reason. And this is a graphic that we like to use. This is actually, it's called A Snapshot on the State of Black Women and Girls Trafficking in the U.S. And this is a publication that was put out by the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. These images are more representative of what our clients look like. Most of our clients are young. They are Black women and girls. So as a direct result of systemic racism, Black women are overrepresented in the criminal sex industry. So it's not surprising that most of our clients here at Amara are young, Black, and female. Consider a few things. Think about a few things. The implicit biases that are held by law enforcement officers, this is a timely discussion, affect their interactions with Black people in general. This is true even when the officer is a person of color. For instance, many officers, have an implicit bias that Black people are more violent, more aggressive, more criminal. And of course, that's not true. Research suggests that women of color are more likely to be arrested for crimes when they were actually the victims of the crime. And why is that? It's because we are perceived as overly aggressive. That's another harmful untruth. Then there's something called the phenomenon of adultification. And this comes out of the legacy of slavery. It causes Black girls to be viewed as needing less protection and knowing more about adult things, adult topics, such as sex, than their white counterparts. And again, this isn't true. So these are some statistics here. The FBI identified DC as one of the 14 cities in the United States with the highest incidence of commercial sexual exploitation of children. In fact, the vast majority of Amara's DC clients are Black Americans who reside in wards 6, 7, and 8. They're US citizens who were born and raised in the DC metropolitan area. So we understand that racism underpins the systemic inequality that our clients face. In fact, again, the vast majority of our clients are Black Americans, Black women. Many of our clients have criminal records that were obtained beyond their control as a result of them being trafficked. So here at Amara, one of the many legal services that we provide, or some of them are expungement and vacatur services, record sealing services to reduce and eliminate barriers that prevent survivors from obtaining housing, student loans, financial aid, employment, and other benefits that they are deprived of because of a criminal record that they got through no fault of their own. Our services, vacatur services, expungement, this helps get people back on their feet and eliminates the barriers that they face, the unfair barriers that they face, and helps them integrate back into society. So that is something that we pride ourselves on doing because there's a real need and we're filling that need in the DMV. So more about the intersection of race and trafficking. It should also be mentioned, I want to also mention that trans and cis women and members of the LGBTQ community are also disproportionately affected in trafficking. In fact, in DC, the majority of trans women are Black or Latina, and trans women of color are more likely to engage in sex work. Of those surveyed in DC's Trans Coalition Needs Assessment, more than half of trans women of color had engaged in sex work in comparison to 12% of their white counterparts. So now we're going to talk about some of the risk factors of trafficking. What makes someone more susceptible to being trafficked? What type of person would a trafficker be looking for? And we'll go through a few of them. Number one, we'll talk about people with a history of childhood abuse and prior experiences with DSS, the Department of Social Services. Why is that a risk factor? And people with a history of childhood abuse are often targeted by traffickers. It may be more difficult for people who have suffered this abuse and trauma to identify unhealthy behaviors, and they might choose to stay in abusive relationships because they believe that their traffickers love them, or they might think that they can't find or don't deserve better. So why is experience with the Department of Social Services a risk factor? It's because many children in the foster care system experience instability at a very early age. They're very vulnerable. They're moved from home to home, and this makes them prime targets for traffickers who look for people's weaknesses. Black children, again, are overrepresented in the foster care system. Another risk factor is mental illness. People who are experiencing mental illness or have a history of trauma. Again, traffickers are exploiters, and they often use tactics like gaslighting, alienation, forcing people to feel guilty. And people who are experiencing mental health trauma and mental health crises are particularly susceptible. DID is something that is another risk factor. DID stands for dissociative identity disorder. Many adult trauma survivors have years and years of experience managing severe trauma while at the same time blocking themselves off from the reality of the trauma that they experienced. And traffickers know how to manipulate an individual's dissociative system, and adult survivors may not even be consciously aware that they are being exploited by a trafficker. Another risk factor is housing insecurity or homelessness. Traffickers often target homeless individuals, people experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity, and they often come to them offering false promises to love and care for them. They pose as romantic partners, and they use force and guilt right from the beginning. And why do they do that? To earn their target's trust. Another risk factor that I want to mention is called self-denigration of self and others. What does that mean? This is tied to child sexual abuse. And again, there are racial contours of sex trafficking in the US. Stereotypes again about Black sexuality, such as bed wench and stud, and traffickers target individuals who, as a result of trauma, have adopted this false narrative. Okay, so how do traffickers go about, approaching their targets? This model is called action means purpose. What does this mean? It means a trafficker, one, takes an action that might be to induce, trick someone, recruit them. I'm a modeling agent and I can hook you up. If you just come with me, I'll hook you up, when they're really a trafficker or a pimp. Harboring, hiding people, transporting people. These are some of the actions that traffickers take. A means, what does that mean? This is how they do it. The means that they use through force, forcing someone, fraud, lying to someone, telling them an untruth to gain their trust, coercion, like inducing someone to do something that they wouldn't normally do. Purpose. These are the purposes: to gain someone's trust, to get them to engage in commercial sex, sex trafficking, and labor trafficking, to provide services against their will. And it should be noted that although someone's making money off of these acts, it's not the person who's being trafficked, it's the traffickers. Just to get into this a little bit more, what do we mean by force, fraud, and coercion? Some examples of force are holding someone against their will, sexual assault, rape, restricting another's freedom of movement, tracking another's movement, like using, electronic surveillance, putting a tracker on someone's car or, on someone's phone. Examples of fraud are offering a modeling job when there really isn't one, not paying someone for their work. Someone who says, again, they're a movie director or a model agent when they're really not. They're really just, they're a pimp. Threats to harm family, confiscating important documents like licenses, passports, filing false reports with legal authorities like ICE or the police department. These are all examples of coercion. So what do we mean by force, fraud, or coercion? Some examples of force are holding someone against their will. More examples: sexual assault, again, rape, just restricting someone's movement. Here are some examples of fraud. Again, saying that they can do something for a person, just basically telling a lie to gain someone's trust, not paying someone for their work. Those are a few of the many examples. So these are some of the terms that are used by sex traffickers in the sex trafficking world. So language is very important because it has the power to be triggering in a negative way, but it can also be empowering in a positive way if it's used appropriately. These are some terms that we hear in the context of our work, and I'll just talk about a few and about the positive and negative connotations of some of them. Survivor, that's a positive term. We refer to individuals who have been harmed by the commercial sex industry as survivors, not as victims. Survivor is an empowering word. Using that word also serves as recognition that our clients are strong and resilient individuals. Survival sex. What does that mean? That refers to exchanging sex to meet one's basic necessities, such as food or housing. Prostitute. That's a word that we don't use unless we're using it in a legal context. It's perceived as a disparaging term, and there's historical stigma surrounding the use of the term prostitute to characterize people who engage in sex work as inferior or less deserving of respect than the rest of society. The term we use here at Amara is sex workers. This is a particularly important distinction because at Amara, our client population includes both sex workers and survivors of sex trafficking. And we want to make sure that our clients don't feel dehumanized in any way based on the language that we use. The only time, again, that we use prostitution is in the context of the criminal legal system, and especially when we're discussing the legal prostitution-related charges that are facing our clients. Another is the life, the game. What does this mean? The subculture of the commercial sex industry and its rules, hierarchy, and language. Many people refer to the act of pimping as the game. And it gives the false illusion that it's cool, when it's really not, that it's something really cool to be in. It's a way to make money. And it's really much grittier than that. Some women and girls will say that they've been in the life if they've been involved in the commercial sex industry for a while. And these are some of the other terms. Modern day slavery is used. We don't use that term at Amara because slavery has a history completely separate from this. We don't use that term because, again, we represent sex workers as well as people who are trafficked. Track, that's pretty much where traffickers hang out. Bottom, this is often someone who is also being trafficked but may not realize it because they're made to feel special. This can sometimes be a woman or a girl who's put in charge by the trafficker of watching everyone and making sure that they're abiding by the trafficker's rules. This, again, people who are bottoms may think of themselves as having a special role, but that's not usually the case. They're usually being exploited in the same way. John, that's another term that we don't use. It typically means the person buying sex. And daddy, that's a term that traffickers often encourage the people that they're trafficking, that they want to be called daddy. So how might you identify a sex trafficker? If there are a few markers here, what are some of the signs? What are the indicators? These are things that might raise your spidey sense. Controlling relationships, just as in DV, but for a little bit different purpose here. For example, somebody constantly needs permission to schedule an appointment, or they don't have access to their bank account or their credit cards, or someone's monitoring their phone calls, or they always have to talk on the phone on the speakerphone so that the other person can hear them. That's a sign of someone who may be being trafficked. Look at the age of the person who's engaging in sex work. Just as a reminder that anyone engaging in sex work under 18 is a victim of sex trafficking, and that's according to federal law. Document confiscation, again, this isn't just the case for immigrants. Although we think of confiscation of things like a passport or a visa, it also happens in domestic trafficking cases where traffickers confiscate or take a person's ID or their social security card or their medical card so that the person can't access public benefits or other resources. Physical or sexual abuse is also a red flag. While it's not necessarily trafficking related, again, you heard from Alana's presentation that sexual abuse is very real. Trafficking is not always a component of that, but that is another risk factor. It's important to screen for this or to think about this in case, for example, if it's a DV or a child abuse situation, it's important to think that this person may also be being trafficked. Someone who has a lot of STDs or has, is going to the hospital all the time or to seek medical attention for STDs, that may well also be another sign of trafficking. Tattoos. Obviously, it's not all tattoos. Many people have tattoos. But if the person has a tattoo that, they're hesitant to tell you what it means, that is not necessarily a sign of trafficking, but it can be. What are some other signs? The inability to give an address. You ask someone where they live and they don't give an address or don't seem to have an address. Lost sense of time. They use scripted and confusing language. They might tell the same story a different way many times. They might be very protective of their trafficker. It's important to remember that many people that are being trafficked, they actually believe that they have a romantic relationship with their trafficker, and they may call the trafficker their boyfriend or their girlfriend. And so for those reasons, they may be very protective. New tattoos all of the time. Again, this is not necessarily a sign of trafficking, but it can be just something to look out for. And especially if the tattoos are like symbols, like barcodes, or, some sort of numbers or acronym that doesn't make sense. Again, not always a sign, but it could be. Another sign of someone who's being trafficked, they may have more than one cell phone. They may have charges that they don't want to talk about. They may have a lot of curfew violations if it's a minor, truancy, not going to school, and many other offenses. And again, I want to emphasize that these are some signs, but these alone don't mean that someone's being trafficked. I won't go over this again. Alana went over this in her presentation, the power and control wheel. I'll just quickly say that survivors of DV, domestic violence, and survivors of trafficking experience physical and sexual violence, as well as psychological harm and trauma. So some services can overlap for people who are being trafficked and people who are in domestic violence situations. And in some situations, not always, the abuser and the trafficker and or the buyer can be the same person. Types of traffickers. So we'll briefly talk about what are traffickers? What does it mean? Who are they? What does it look like? What are they called? These are just some of the terms that we'll go through quickly. Romeo pimp. Again, traffickers come in all shapes and sizes, and just like there's not one model trafficking survivor, there's not one model trafficker either. So we loosely categorize them into the following types. Romeo pimp, he or she is a master manipulator who puts a lot of time and energy into building trust and affection during the recruitment phase. Romeo pimps typically shower their victims with affection and expensive gifts. They often appear to be the perfect partner. Later on, and this can take weeks or months, when they've gained the person's trust, they start making demands that their target start engaging in commercial sex work. They just start slipping that in. Familial trafficking. Unfortunately, trafficking can happen within families. A person can be trafficked by a family member or trafficked by family members for financial gain, to pay the rent or to buy food. Another type of trafficker is called a guerrilla trafficker. And that's just basically a pimp who uses physical violence or force to control those that they are trafficking. Again, booster, what does that mean? uses someone who has a pre-existing drug dependence or creates an addiction by withholding drugs as punishment and then giving drugs as a reward. So traffickers often prey on someone who has a substance abuse issue, or they'll create one. Gang trafficking is based on the idea that the gang is like a family. It's like a family-like structure with severe consequences for breaking any of the family rules. On one hand, it looks appealing to a young person who might want to belong to a community or a family. On the other hand, gangs often trick individuals into thinking that they're being initiated as members of the gang, whereas they're really being trafficked for the gang's profits. It's very difficult to leave a gang-related trafficking situation because of their extensive network and intimidation tactics. They often use violence and retaliation to make examples of those who are disloyal to the gang. Therefore, they're instilling fear in their targets or members who stay. Grooming, what is grooming? Grooming is like the early stage of trafficking. It's a process that traffickers use to prepare their traffickers to be controlled and prepare them to be manipulated into being trafficked. Again, traffickers are master manipulators. If there's an unmet need, they'll say that they can fill it, whether that's, anything, love, drugs, a place to stay, family. Then they get a person's trust. And then the person becomes turned out and they're forced and coerced into commercial sex. Grooming tactics work most successfully when the person being trafficked is young, between the ages of 11 and 16. That's when our normal human brains are still developing. And according to the National Institutes of Health, a teen's brain is highly sensitive to pleasure and reward as the nucleus accumbens is nearly fully developed. But the prefrontal cortex, and that's the part of the brain that helps us make major decisions and helps us anticipate consequences or foresee consequences for certain behaviors, that's not fully developed in most humans until their mid-20s. So where do traffickers recruit? They hang out in public places where young people go. There's something called catfishing, and that means luring someone into a relationship by means of a fictional online persona. So that takes us to social media. Social media is a real recruiting ground for people who are traffickers. Why is that? Because it builds quicker and often false relationships. Self-erasing technology is involved. It means, they can go on the dark web and their identity can be kept unknown. They can develop a second persona. They can be anybody they want to be online. Often people don't know who they're talking to. People who are being targeted for trafficking, they think they're talking to one person or one type of person, and the person that they're actually talking to has nothing to do with who they think they're talking to. So again, public places, social media, those are some hot spots. Pimps often troll the internet and pose as, again, someone interesting for a friendship or a relationship when they are nothing of the sort. So I'll quickly go over a couple of just hypotheticals. So Dominique is a 15-year-old who decided to leave her house after getting into a huge fight with her mom. She contacted a friend and then another friend trying to find a place to stay, but she had no luck. As a last resort, she contacted an acquaintance, 23-year-old Tracy. Tracy told Dominique that she can come over to stay at his apartment anytime, and he even send some of his friends to pick up Dominique. Dominique is confused when three strange men arrive, but since she trusts Tracy, she gets in the car anyway. Instead of taking Dominique to Tracy's house, they take her to a local motel where Tracy dresses Dominique in skimpy clothing and takes pictures. Despite not wanting to, and in exchange for a place to stay, Dominique engages in sex work. The three strangers take all the money that Dominique makes and they leave. Dominique realizes that she's in an unsafe situation. So after nearly 24 hours in the motel room, when the three strangers leave the room, she sneaks out and she reports her experience to the police. A couple of questions. Is this trafficking? The answer is yes. There's someone being forced to engage in sex or drugged to engage in sex. The fact that Dominique is 15 years old, remember what we talked about earlier, She's a minor, it's automatically sex trafficking. So Dominique could not consent. So is this trafficking? Yes, it is. Another quick hypothetical, John has been selling drugs to young women. In exchange for drugs, he makes one already severely addicted young woman, woman A, sleep with him. He then gives her the drugs. He also recruits women experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity who are already engaging in sex work and promise to help get them off the streets. Instead, he intentionally and rapidly escalated their drug use into full addictions. He just exploited their addictions or their substance abuse. And he told them that they had to engage in sex work and give him their earnings. He threatened to withhold the drugs from them if they didn't comply. Is this sex trafficking? Absolutely. This is John coercing these women into engaging in sex for something of value to them. The value to them is the drugs. He is cultivating addictions, totally exploiting these women for his own gain. Again, John's making the money, the women are not. He's just getting them hooked on drugs or feeding an already existing addiction. So this is absolutely trafficking. So I want to talk a little bit wrap it up talking a little bit about what we do here at Amara. We represent clients in family law matters. That's divorce, custody, child support, paternity. Again, we provide vacature and expungements and record sealing services. What does that mean? Vacature means it goes away. It doesn't exist anymore. And DC and Maryland, vacature is available in DC and Maryland. There'll be no criminal record. It's a process where if it can be shown that the person obtained this criminal record, due to their involvement in sex trafficking, it will go away. And that just frees up someone's hindrances that they have the criminal record that they obtained, again, through no force of their own. That's available in DC and Maryland. Virginia is working on it. Expungements, that's similar, but that's just getting it off the record. It doesn't go away completely as if it never happened, but it expunges the charge. It makes it go away. There's record sealing. Also, record sealing is another method through which the record is sealed, but it's still there and can be obtained by some law enforcement agencies. We also provide civil protection orders. We help people obtain civil protection orders against their traffickers and abusers. We provide victim witness advocacy services in which a victim, someone who's been trafficked, may want to pursue charges against their trafficker. So what we will do is walk them through the process, often a very scary process. We help them with their victim witness statements and provide other services and support. Criminal defense, we represent individuals who have been trafficked and also sex workers who have obtained criminal records. We advocate for them and represent them in their criminal matters. Policy, I mentioned earlier that our Virginia attorney is working very hard to bring Virginia up to speed so that vacature is available and so that minors are protected through the safe harbor laws that we talked about. We also provide technical assistance. We help other organizations who are also providing the same services. We'll give assistance and guidance when needed, and we also offer training such as this one. So we're doing a lot here, and we just want to make sure that our services are known. If you or someone you know needs legal services, please call us at this number, 240-257-6492, or send us an email to info@amaralegal.org. We also have some available resources on our website. So I know this is a lot of information, but again, hope this was helpful. Feel free to contact us to find out more information, let other people know about us, just get the word out that we're here. We're here to help. Thanks and take care.
Hi everyone, my name is Alicia Webster and I am a forensic nurse. I have been a forensic nurse since 2016 and I have practiced in Albuquerque, New Mexico and here in the District of Columbia. A medical forensic exam is a specialized exam conducted by a nurse who has underwent specialized training in forensics. If you are a survivor of intimate partner violence and have been assaulted, you are eligible to receive an exam with DC forensic nurse examiners. During an intimate partner and violence exam, we will evaluate your overall medical history in addition to incidents that are pertinent to whatever you've experienced. For example, when you come into our clinic, we will take your regular vital signs, check you from head to toe as you would going to see your primary provider. After that, we would ask you exactly what happened. This is what's called your narrative. What that does is that helps guide the forensic portion of the exam, which is a little bit more specialized. What that portion includes is injury identification and documentation. We document both in writing, but also through the use of photos. For example, if you have an injury, this was an injury on someone, we take 3 different sets of photos. The first photo is from a little further away to show where the injury is in location on the body. The second photo is used with a measuring device to see exactly how big it is and where it lays anatomically. And the third photo is a little bit more up close so we can see and identify exactly what injury that would be. There are screenings that we do for strangulation. Strangulation is something that is very fatal and is a leading cause of homicide among women. These are a few of the items that we can use to help with our injury identification. One of the things that we will ask if people feel comfortable to do is to demonstrate on a mannequin exactly how that person was strangled. This can be difficult for a person to do, but what it helps do is we as forensic nurses can see exactly where the pressure was on the neck, and that helps to guide for injury. For example, if this was a person and I was doing an evaluation, I would also use additional tools to be able to check their eyes, inside of their ears, and other areas of the head and neck that most people who do not have specialized training in strangulation would not be able to see signs or symptoms of. You can also use what is called an alternate light source. This can be used alongside strangulation or all on its own to identify injuries on the body. One of the benefits to using an alternate light source such as this is it makes it easier to identify injuries that sometimes may not be visible to the naked eye. What that means is that this tool can pick up bruising, injury, and things that are underneath the skin that sometimes do not show up in regular light. So for example, we use these specialized goggles and lights to look for injuries that makes them a little bit easier to see. These exams are free, available to anyone with or without insurance, and are available with or without law enforcement involvement. To contact us for these exams, you would call the DC Victim Hotline, and that phone number is 1-844-4HELP-DC.